Okay, and now we can define our advantage function and use it as the critique for a policy gradient theorem, for an actor critique framework. So eventually what we would like to do is to shift the policy towards actions that result in higher return. Right? So we want to update our policy over time towards better performance, obviously. What is the benefit from taking action A at state S while following a policy pi? So we currently have a policy pi, and then we did some exploration and we tried a new action, and we would like to know if this action is beneficial. Should we perform more of A or less of A given our current policy? So what is that benefit?
If we have the Q value and the value function, it would just be the difference. We would get the advantage.
But a specific value function, right?
Yes,
specific.
The value function for this state S and the Q value for a certain state in action.
Under the current policy.
Yes.
That's the important. So the Q value should be evaluated for this policy and the state value for this policy. And then you can say for this specific policy, for pi, it's better you can leave everything the same, but for this state, maybe you should slightly push it towards action A. Because even if you have the same policy, it's beneficial, it's better for you to perform more of A over whatever the current policy tells you to do. And indeed, this is our advantage function, denoted with a capital A. It relates to a specific policy. It will try to tell you the advantage of taking an action, taking more of a specific action at a specific state for a given policy. And as you said, it will just be the difference between the Q value under the current policy for state S and action A minus the current state evaluation under policy pi for state S. So for instance, what would be the advantage for taking an action that, well, in any case is going to be taken by our current policy? So if our current policy tells you to take action A at state S, what is the advantage for action A at state S?
Zero?
Zero, right, because, well, it is what it is. I mean, in any case, it's doing the same. But if you have an action that is probably better to take at state S or will return a higher expected return than the current, so V of pi, I'll just remind you, it's similar to Q of S, pi of S, right? Q. If you do Q pi of S and take an action that is pi of S. So it's exactly the same, right? And if we take an action other than the action recommended by our current policy, then, well, the advantage can be higher or lower, depending on the difference between the Q value and the state value. And now you might say that this is similar to the policy gradient theorem with the policy gradient that we derived previously, policy gradient approximation with baseline. But it's not exactly the same, right? For the policy gradient theorem, we said, yeah, it's Q minus V pi, right? And then we changed Q. We said, okay, how do we know Q? We just said, okay, we'll just use G. But we did use define this advantage, or the same function, in our policy gradient derivation, policy gradient theorem. But it's not exactly the same. And you might say, well, V pi is just a baseline. We've seen that before. But it's not exactly the same, because now the Q value, it's not the real Q value, it's just an approximation of the Q value. And this is where the critique comes into play. Okay, so eventually actions that improve on the current policy are encouraged, right? They have an advantage that is larger than zero, and actions that damage the current policy are discouraged. They have an advantage that is lower than zero. Okay, and again, the advantage function is just an approximation. We don't know the true Q value. We use an approximation of the Q value, and this is where the critique comes into play. Okay, So we'll use the advantage function and we'll approximate both the Q values and the state values. We'll use approximation of the Q value and the state value. And now you might say, well, does this mean that we need to approximate, in order to approximate the advantage in a given state and for a given state and action pair, are we required now to train two different function approximators on top of the policy approximator, right? So do we need to now approximate the Q? Do we need to have a Q approximator and a state approximator?
No, because the Q function is a function of the value function.
Right, so we've seen this before. Actually, Q and so action values, the Q, and state values, the V, are very similar. I mean, they can be derived one from each other, right? So we don't need to approximate both of them. We can approximate one and then just use the definition of how we change between the two and use that as the other's values. Right, so specifically we're going to just train a state value and derive the Q values from the state values. How can we do that? Of course, we can do it in both ways, but we're going to actually train state values and just say that the Q value is simply the expectation from taking the action AT at ST for the expected value for the immediate reward plus the discounted state value for the next state that we're going to encounter. So we're going to have the expectation over immediate reward and next state. And indeed we can use that as our Q value and change this in our advantage function, right, instead of the Q value. And now we have something that should be very familiar for us. This is exactly the one-step TDL, temporal difference error, or what we called small delta previously. Right, and we multiply that by, well, the continuation of the policy gradient theory. Gradient of the natural logarithm, or it's fine also to use just any log of the policy at action AT for a given state ST and our current tunable parameters, our current policy. Okay, moving forward. One-step actor critique. One step, I mean one step that uses one-step TDL. Of course, we can use n-step bootstrapping. We'll see such an approach later on. This is a fully online incremental algorithm with state, actions, and reward processed as they occur and then never revisited. By online, I mean that it performs the updates online while acting, okay, at each time step. And indeed, now we can define the pseudocode for a one-step actor critique, or A2C, advantage actor critique. This is known as, well, AAC, advantage actor critique, or A2C. And by the way, you will implement this algorithm for your home assignment. In this case, the input is, as we saw previously in policy iteration algorithm, is a differentiable policy with some random initialization. Right? The parameters are a theta vector and are assumed to be randomly initialized. And we also have a differentiable state value parameterization or approximation function V hat. Each of these two might have a different, they usually require different step sizes that need to be optimized with hyperparameter tuning separately. Okay, so how will this algorithm work? Probably you can understand from now that we'll just at each time step we'll update both our actor and the critique. Actor based on TD learning. We can do, this is the simple approach, one-step TD learning, but we can easily extend this to n-step TD learning, n-step bootstrapping, and at each step we're also going to use the policy gradient theorem to update our policy. So we start by keeping by setting an identity matrix that keeps tracks of the accumulated discounts. Then we simply follow the current policy at each time step while the state is not terminal, or this can easily work for continual problems, so while forever, it's also fine. We choose an action from our current policy, we take the action and observe the outcomes, the next state and the immediate reward. Then we can compute the TD error based on this transition, right? The TD error is small delta. Next, we're going to update the critique without the accumulated discount. The discount factor is included in the TD error, right here. Right, and this is a simple one-step TD error update, one-step bootstrapping for a state value approximation, right? So the W are the set of tunable parameters for our state evaluation. Next, we're going to update the actor with discounting, right, with the I matrix here. And the TD error, as we've seen previously, this will be our advantage. This is our advantage, as we've seen before, multiplied by the grad log pi. Next, we're going to update the accumulated discount and progress to the next state. Now, practically, we don't update the accumulated discount factor in practice because there's no practical need for it. And also in your home assignment, you can ignore this. You don't have to update the I and you don't have to multiply it here. So for your home assignment, when you implement A2C, please don't. I mean, you could, but you don't need to keep track of these I values. Okay, there's no practical need for that. And as I said before, we can also use tricks that we've seen before for n-step bootstrapping that might be very useful, specifically in long horizon planning and for domains that are less noisy, less stochastic, more deterministic, and then n-step bootstrapping can help a lot speed up the learning, help a lot with the sample efficiency. So we've seen before how to use eligibility traces to do n-step bootstrapping, a moving average of the n-step bootstrapping from n0 all the way to n infinity in some sense. But now we'll have to store the gradient eligibility per tunable parameter for both the actor and the critique approximators. Right, and of course we can do all kinds of games here where we do different eligibility vectors and different eligibility weights for the actor and the critique. But in the more general case, we just keep the eligibility vectors for each one of them, or we store them, and we update the eligibility vector at each time step. And of course, the updates for both the W and the theta parameters are multiplied by those eligibility vectors.